And we're live with our 276th episode of Absolute AppSec. I'm Ken Johnson at CK Tricky on social media, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on social media. Seth, say hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode. We're a little bit time shifted this week, but that is to accommodate a great guest that we have on today. We're excited to talk with Myles about his work in Node and NPM and at GitHub. Really excited to get some of his insight into different things. So we'll do a introduction, background, origin story, and everything here in just a minute. Before we dive into that, though, I did want to give a shout out to Redpoint for being our sponsor of this episode. Redpoint Security specializes in code security by coders, which is bolstered by years of experience testing apps and conducting code reviews against all types of applications. Redpoint also offers secure code training to help ground your teams in better security practices across the development lifecycle. So check out redpointsecurity.com for more information and put your team and company on a path to better security. So thanks to Redpoint. There is also another training opportunity this week. If you have not heard yet, you haven't been listening, but we are teaching our Harnessing LLMs for Application Security course this week, February 20th and 22nd, or 20th and 21st. Sorry, I'm skipping days in my head, apparently. Go to training.absoluteappsec.com to sign up. We still have a couple of seats available and would love to have more people in the course. So this is the opportunity. We're not quite sure when we're going to bring back LLMs for AppSec. There's the space is changing quite a bit on a monthly basis, and it's causing us to actually have to update the syllabus every single time we do this. So just be aware that there are changes that are going on behind the scenes with this one to keep you up to date. So sign up there. And otherwise, Ken, anything else that you can think of that we should announce before we jump into it with Myles here? And you're muted. So
sorry, I was trying not to click too hard as I'm watching chat and whatnot. Yeah, no, not at all. And super happy to have Myles here. I obviously, I mean, I'm stoked. I worked with Myles. I had reached out to Myles actually just to tell Myles that I've loved working with Myles. And that turned into a longer conversation. And it's just, again, super grateful to have you here. If folks are not familiar, Myles, essentially, I work with Myles on the in his capacity at NPM. Myles, we're going to get into your origin story here in a moment, but you've everything from seeing the full sort of NPM, becoming kind of a rocket ship and everybody using it for package registry type of activity, and then all the stuff that you dealt with that goes along with growth and security and things of that nature. But before that, you're at Google. Now you're at Snowflake. Really great career. Well-known speaker, well-known author in terms of code and whatnot. And I'm just like super grateful to have you on here. So thank you, Myles, for joining us. Can't wait to pick your brain on this episode.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. It's like one of those funny things. A lot of the time that we worked together was not because something good was going on. Like anytime you and I had to collaborate was because it was a little bit of a fire. And I think we would always end those engagements being like, I hope I don't have to see you soon, but I like working with you.
Exactly. The reasons were never obviously super positive, but the outcomes and working with you always was. We definitely dealt with some. I mean, you more. I feel like in our role in security, it was more of just the sort of heads up in general, like, here's some level of input, but the majority of the actual work was you and your team. So, I figure, if you don't mind just kind of giving people your background and how you got to where you are now, that's always interesting to hear of folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a bit of a non-traditional background. I didn't even start programming until my early 20s. Like I screwed around in high school a bit, and I used to idle on IRC, but not for programming reasons. But I got back into it through music. I played a lot of music through my whole life, and in my early 20s, I got into electronic music like big time, and started to look at how people were producing electronic music. And hold on, I should have pulled this up before. I've got this device actually right here. This is called a monome. It's a grid of buttons. It does nothing. This was the first thing I ever soldered. I want to say it was like 2008 or 2009. And I got so into just learning how people were making electronic music and into site-based installation. And I ended up going back to school to study what they called integrated media at the Ontario College of Art and Design. Most art programs have that one place where they send people who are like playing with electronics and code and stuff. There's always a different name. OCAD called it integrated media. And this was in a time before Raspberry Pis, for example, but I was doing a lot of stuff with embedded Linux and with Arduinos, with microcontrollers, with websites. I was very into open technology and not working with apps. But I really came at it from like an artistic and music perspective. When I graduated from my undergrad, I was extremely lucky and I got into CARMA, which is the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics at Stanford, and did a graduate degree in music technology. And I got into the deep end doing everything from like the Stanford Systems programming classes to building sound engines, to building audio codecs, to building instruments with embedded Linux, which I actually ended up teaching a class on. And I went right from there, like right into the tech world. And the first startup I worked at was called, it was called Famous. And it was a open source 3D physics engine and animation suite. It doesn't exist anymore. It was really weird. It was part of the first like TechCrunch Disrupt group. And it was so much just like the TV show Silicon Valley. It was so silly. It was a lot of fun. We could spend a whole podcast just talking about that. So I'm gonna not. But I did a lot of tooling work there, and that was like kind of a lot of my career was just like how deep can I go with tooling and infrastructure, and a lot of stuff with JavaScript. And we ended up doing a partnership with the jQuery Foundation and with the Node.js Foundation, which had just founded around then. And we ended up planning a conference called jQuery SF. And in San Francisco Valley style, all the executives quit from the company. And I, who was at the time a junior engineer, was the only one who actually gone to a conference. So I was the one who had to organize the conference, which had me working with a bunch of the executives from the jQuery Foundation, which included this guy, Andy B. Smith from IBM. Built a good relationship with him. About 2 months later, I got laid off. The whole company imploded. It turns out raising a series. Anyways, I won't get into that. I don't need to slander. It was great. It just, there wasn't a market fit.
Sure, yeah.
And so Andy rang me up, and this was at the exact same time as the IOJS fork from Node. I was just like, hey, you have a good reputation in the JavaScript ecosystem. You love open source. Do you want to come work at IBM full time to just maintain Node.js? Like, we're about to do a merger. We want someone to do that. And I was hired to work full time. And like my OKR was build trust in the Node.js ecosystem for IBM. And if you're not familiar with IBM and their open tech arm, IBM benefits greatly. And I love this strategy from the commoditization of technology. If things are open, and this is why they invested so much in Linux, then they can sell services for it. So they wanted to have Node running on all their weirdo architectures, on PowerPC, on Z System, on Little and Big Endian, like all the weird combos. So they had a whole team of like compiler engineers working on V8. But like if the Node project didn't trust them, none of this stuff would land. So I was just in there. I built the original smoke testing suite for Node. I did a lot of contributions, built out their LTS program, and did pretty much every single Node release for a couple of years. And that led me to Google, where I was working as DevRel, yada, yada, yada. Did some work for TC39, did some work for the language. I standardized top level await. And got really deep into like the JavaScript language itself. And that led me to a role at GitHub, which just kind of catches us up to where you wanted to chat about. And NPM, too big to fail, public registry of JavaScript, was purchased by GitHub. And at the time that GitHub purchased it, they were very interested in, like finding some people to come in and help with that. And so my boss at the time, Jeremy, well, my future boss, Jeremy Epling, and I started talking. And I had it leaked to me through the grapevine that GitHub was going to acquire NPM, but it wasn't public knowledge. And if you've ever done anything through acquisitions, like you absolutely can't talk about it. So Jeremy and I had multiple meetings, funny enough, to talk about supply chain security and the importance of supply chain security, which were these like phantom interviews before like they could even announce a role because the acquisition wasn't even publicly available. So
just a sort of hypothetical conversation.
Yeah, just like Myles, what's your thoughts on supply chain security and like what would you do with a JavaScript registry and yada yada? So I ended up taking the role, and it was my first product role at IBM. I was in software engineering. At Google, I was a developer advocate, and so this was transitioning into product. And I was one of 2 staff PMs, me and this other gentleman, Ed Thompson, who's phenomenal contributor. He's over at Stacklock now. There's a way that NPM turns you into security experts, whether you like it or not. And
yeah, right.
We were running product for the registry, and it did not take me long from when I got there until we started to run into some incidents. And I expanded my role at GitHub a whole bunch, and eventually I was a director of product, and NPM was part of my AOR. But yeah, there's some gnarly things that happen on my watch, which I think we'll talk about in a second.
Yeah.
And just a couple, I want to say just less than 6 months ago, I moved from GitHub over to Snowflake to help run their developer platform, which is what I'm doing now. I'm learning a lot more about databases. Most of my career had not been in the data space. It was much more on systems. But they need more people with, like app dev and systems experience to help shape things. Snowflake is interesting where it's like everything is a SQL API. And that kind of like breaks my brain as someone who's not used to that. Yeah. So it's like, if you want to make a feature, okay, cool. You got to like figure out like the SQL query to like build that feature out. And then you build things on top of that. But I'll pause, I'll take a breath, and maybe you have some questions or things you want to dig into about that path.
Yeah, I mean, I had a smaller question, just sort of like because I'll ask the smaller question, and I have a more like relevant question to the NPM. The other one's not so relevant, but it's just on my mind, which is like, you mentioned going from a sort of a music background. I know I'm going way back to the beginning, but you mentioned that like you had sort of this music aspiration, and you built around, on top of technology, codecs and whatnot, to accomplish that. And then you took a technology job after. And I was just curious, like, was it because you decided like, I actually really like technology and this is, a decent career field, or was it somebody reaching out to you and saying like, you should really do, or just sort of like, I missed the jump there between the aspiration to work on producing music and then landing in technology?
Yeah, I would say it's a couple different things that played into it. One would be just I was constantly obsessed with like process and systems. And that's just like something that's been forever in my life. That's why I love JRPGs so much. And I'm super deep into coffee right now, for example. I could spend a whole podcast talking about like my current espresso setup and the plumbing I'm going to be doing and yada, yada. Anyways,
sure.
So part of it is just like the systems. Part of it is reality. Like the market space for music technology is quite narrow, and that's great. And it's really, really cool. And if you can find your niche there, it's awesome. And I had some cool opportunities there. But frankly, I saw a little bit of a ceiling that made me uncomfortable. I don't like ceilings in general. So like that was just something that like kind of aired me away from music technology as like a general career path. And then I was very much allured to the shininess that was Silicon Valley and the Bay Area and all of that. I'm now back in Toronto and clearly disillusioned. But like that's a whole other thing. But like being able to go just be a part of that was very alluring to me at that time in my life. And I would say, like probably until this job at Snowflake, which is a little bit of a different path that I'm taking right now. But I was a huge proponent of the open web and open source. And even all the way back to like that first instrument, the Mono was an open hardware device. And so if you really track that progress, everything was very much about contributing to open standards, to open source, working towards the open web and working on those technologies. And I don't want to say that I've been disillusioned by that as well over time, because I still care deeply about open source. But I kind of feel like I did my tour of duty to a certain extent.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
like
Mhm.
GitHub, ironically, was the start of a path away from giving all of my energy to open source. I'm sure I'll give more again in the future, but I'm focusing right now a lot more on myself, my mental health, my family, my young child, and I don't have the energy to give to community and open source the way that I did maybe like a decade ago. So that's a
Mhm.
very intentional shift. But at that point in my career, to answer your question, I was very much drawn. Like that first company I worked for was open source. Like they brought me in to help manage the open source program, to help drive contribution on GitHub, and I was super passionate and remain
Yeah.
passionate in that space.
Yeah, and like, that's such a yeah, that's a normal thing, I think, to do your, like you said, your tour duty or put your time in, and then sort of like, all right, this is what it really requires of me, and then you do that for long enough, and you're like, okay, well, I have other things going on in life, and it's all, ebbs and flows, and life is up and down, and yeah, that's totally
Yep.
makes a lot of sense. But of course, I was curious. Now, getting to it, the interesting or so one thing I think everybody would be interested in is like day one, you walk in,
Yes.
you're
Let's get
handed
there.
this code base. I know this code base, at least not no, I shouldn't say, actually I should say I'm not sure if anybody knows the code base, but well, maybe as much as you, but that code base was interesting primarily because we're dealing with some custom frameworks, things people built themselves, right? Not something that we have tooling for, that we have a lot of knowledge of, like opinionated conventions, none of that, right? So I know, but if you could express to folks sort of like the situation of what you're walking into on day one, what are you tasked with? You know, what direction are you going in at this point?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, if like when I started, I wasn't working directly on the registry. So NPM had been acquired. There were a number of people who stuck around post acquisition, but quite a number didn't. There was a team, the App Center team. They had created the team that had done Hockey App, and then App Center were brought in to help run the registry. So it was like 30 or 40 people across the registry and the CLI. Of all the places, the CLI itself had the most kind of like holdover of kind of like original maintainers and people from NPM. And kind of my first course of action, because I was being ramped up both into NPM but also into being a product manager, if I'm being honest. And I was hired as a staff PM with no experience, and that was a big kind of jumping in the deep end. The way my boss put it is like, you're going to be like the best person at GitHub on some of these things, and then like there's some things that you're not going to know anything about, and we're going to need to teach you. Um, but I was brought in to help with the CLI first, and also to help with some of the trickier, like public-facing bits of things, because I understood the ecosystem really deeply. And one of the first things that we needed to do was to get NPM 7 out the door.
Mm.
So the NPM 6 client had been around for quite some time. The NPM team had been trying to get 7 out the door, and for a variety of reasons, including just like capacity of running that whole place near the end being tough, 7 wasn't getting out the door. And then there was also just, and I see this a lot more now as a PM with my PM hat from Leon, just like the longer you wait to make a big release, the harder it becomes to do it, the more it ends up on a pedestal, the more you start worrying about the perfectionism of it all. And it becomes especially hard if like you're the person who loves the thing. And so like I was working with like Isaac, who created NPM, and like, this is in some ways like his magnum opus. He's got a new one that he's working on, a new registry with a few people from the team. But
Oh,
it was
interesting.
really hard to get them to kind of push through and just kind of mint 7. They were making some pretty significant changes to the way that things worked. They had a whole bunch of really critical goals, and they never could quite get it. And so that was kind of the first task I was given with, was just like, hey, get this team to ship this thing. We can't get this team to ship the thing. And I spent a lot of time on that. Ed, who is my counterpart, was mentioning, was working much more on the registry. And a lot of that was just getting the new team set up, getting that engineering team understanding what was going on with the registry. You mentioned the whole code base and everything. And like, yeah, like that was a lot they
Challenging.
needed to ramp up on. There was a huge focus on paper cuts at that time and just like in reliability. And the whole time I was at GitHub, reliability was a massive focus for GitHub all up, and especially for NPM. That was a huge challenge. As I ramped up, they actually tried to move me on to some other things. Like they gave me GitHub releases for a little while, which was interesting because I was a huge power user of that when I was doing the Node.js releases.
Was that because didn't at one point there was a notion that like releases was going to be like the package manager essentially? Is that maybe what they were thinking potentially?
It wasn't exactly related to that. It was just Nat one day like woke up and was like, we're going to do a thing called releases galore. We need to invest in releases. We haven't done anything for 10 years. And so
Oh, I see.
with my background and understanding, that was kind of given to me to like ramp up and build some of my product management skills, which ended up being both a terrible and great experience. It was my first time ever like delivering to executive leadership product plans. But as I started, they tried to ramp me up into that was when some of these ATO incidences started happening with NPM. And it became like a running joke over a period of about 3 years that every time they tried to move me onto something else, there would just be like some wild incident that would bring me back in. The charter of NPM also moved hands a couple times while we were at GitHub during my tenure. You had a team that came in that was like really about getting it platformed into GitHub, and then another team that came in that was much more about maintenance. And a lot of the bigger incidents, of course, just timing wise, happened to happen during the handoff of that charter. But I think the big one that a lot of people knew was, I want to say it was like late 2021, where there was an ATO of pretty big package, one that was downloaded about 1 million times a month. I don't have my notes in front of me. Maybe I should have had them. I
No,
definitely
worries.
could pull up with more details. But it was really tough because like I remember the moment where like I was walking down the street and I like was busy for the day doing other things, and I finally like checked Slack and like everything's on fire, and we didn't even realize that this package had been published for a couple hours. And there was like a number of different ways that we could have been notified, from tickets coming in to security to a scanning service that we had been investing in, but like wasn't set up to do alerts, to just like support. And like all of these different checks and balances that we had in place, like none of them were hardwired. And so that sat for a couple hours, and quite a number of machines could have been compromised by that malware being released. And we course corrected really quickly due to that. We actually put that malware scanning service into production and set it up to like alert a bunch of people if it scanned anything on. We defined what we called a high impact package, which was a package with more than 1 million downloads or more than 500 dependents. We set up a whole bunch of policies around that. So like if anything smelly happened with any of those packages, like we would have on-call pinged. We made some other policy changes as well. And there was another 2 ATOs that happened about a month later, and they were up for 30 minutes and 15 minutes. So like we got a response
much better
time
than 2 hours. Yeah.
Way down. Yeah.
Way down. And at the end of the day, there's a ton of malware that gets published to every public registry on the planet. Like you really can't stop it, especially with AI. Malware and spam can just be automated. And one of the things that had come up is like you've got people at like Debian, for example, where like the only people who can publish are like super vetted individuals, and they need to use GPG, and there's all this stuff. But there's something magical about the JavaScript ecosystem and about Node. Like I published a package for managing open sound control to the NPM registry. I want to say it was 2011 or 2000. Yeah, I think it was 2011. It was early enough that I announced it to the Google group. But like, if Node.js and NPM wasn't as approachable and usable as it was for me as like an art student trying to make an installation, I don't think I would even have my career today, because I would not have had the on-ramp. And so, while I was working in NPM, there was quite a lot of feedback that we had gotten from people that was like, well, why don't you do all these things that essentially just like make it harder to use? Like, why don't you force some level of verification before people can publish? And the reality is that, like, if your security boundaries become so high that you reduce usability and developer experience, like either A, people just like aren't going to use it and aren't engaged, or they're going to find ways around it. A little different when you're talking about a registry in a business.
Well, yeah, it is, because
it's-
I mean, we see that between like NPM, how it's used, and then things like the gated app stores that are out there, right? Like Apple's done really well, but it's because they curate that experience, and they've got like all of their restrictions, but it also limits what people can do. I can see that being like a huge driver. I don't think NPM would be as large as it is, or the JavaScript ecosystem, if we had those fine guardrails in place.
But we can also reduce risk. And so, like, one of the things that we ended up doing, which was a lot of work, was MFA enforcement for NPM. But it's, again, was done in a way that was very strategic and very thoughtful. So we didn't enforce MFA for everyone. We turned on email verification for all accounts. That was a huge win. If you enforce email verification, you pretty much stop like drive-by password stuffing attacks immediately. And that's why, like, it's annoying, but like pretty much every company makes you like verify via email now at some point in an authentication flow. Maybe not for every login, but at least like a verification on account setup. But if you just force someone to like verify via email for login, you stop most password stuffing attacks in their tracks. And so that was pretty phenomenal. Then we started to enforce for accounts. I see you put top 100. So yeah, we started with the top 100 and we eventually rolled it out to all accounts. We invested in the overall like authentication flow for NPM quite significantly. Originally, it only supported TOTP as a second factor. We introduced support for WebAuthn. We also improved the way in which 2FA worked from the CLI. So like, this is really important, especially if you're publishing packages in CI. If we, like, for example, like, think about like people enforcing policy without thinking about it, which, maybe a global thing we have to be concerned about. But like, if you just blanket, we're like, everyone needs MFA all the time, then you would break every CI infrastructure. Similarly, if you all of a sudden like forced MFA on accounts and then block things if people didn't set it up, you would break automation suites, which are more or less like working. And so we did this thing where basically the way we enforced 2FA, we did it on only particular accounts, and we did it to more accounts as we invested in the infrastructure. We also didn't invalidate existing authentication tokens for folks that had already been minted and were working and in production. We introduced new token types, one that was called an automation token, that you could enforce 2FA on your account, but not enforce it for an automation token. And then we made it even better with something called a granular access token, where you could mint a token scoped specifically to specific organizations or even specific packages, and set like rotation requirements so that they expired after a certain amount of time. And we just kind of watched the adoption over time from people. And, the more tools that we give people to be able to like actually have good account hygiene with a strong developer experience, the more adoption that we saw. And the biggest risk really actually came down to account recovery. And this was like a fun one. John Swanson and I talked a lot about this, where your account security is actually only as good as your account recovery process. Because if you have all of these things for authentication in place, but it's really easy to get them all deactivated through like some basic social engineering with a support person, it doesn't really matter. You don't need that account security at all. And we had people who were trying and some successfully early on, to social engineer our support people to give up accounts. So for example, one attack that was pretty popular for a little while, and it is not as successful as people may think, but is called the domain expiration attack. So when you publish to NPM, we mint the email address that you use when you publish.
Okay.
So you could build a registry crawler, and there is a API you can use to look at every package that's on the registry and see who the publishers are and see what email addresses they are. And from that, make a list of all, custom URLs that are used to publish, and then see if any of them are expired. And then, hey, if it's expired, I can go register that domain, and then I can go and do an account recovery on it. And, oh, wait, that account has 2FA. Oh, well, I'll just write support from the email address of the account and say, hey, can you remove 2FA? And so we had to do some stuff to fight against that. And I'll be a little vague. I know, security through obscurity is not really a thing, but also, why get people?
Yeah, why make it easy?
But we have
Exactly.
NPM has mechanisms in place to identify expired domains and basically marks accounts that are recognized as expired domains. And when that happens, the email address can no longer be used as part of identity verification when validating an account. And there's a point system, and I'll be vague about that as well, where essentially you have a certain number of points of identity that you can do through verification. And then based on you need N number of points, once we have N number of points, then we consider you verified, and we'll disable 2FA or allow you to reset it. And yeah, if you have an expired domain in your account, we find it, and you can't use the email address anymore to validate it. And there's really in-depth playbooks that we had to write for support. And yeah, there's two different things there that are really challenging, and GitHub dealt with this too with their MFA enforcement for all of GitHub, is the human hours that are needed, because as you ramp up enforcements for MFA, you ramp up the number of people who lose their key and need to reset their account, or get locked out of their accounts, or lose access to the account that the business was publishing from. And that actually becomes one of the biggest costs in the whole thing. And people don't even think about, we had to write a staffing guide and put up a headcount, get headcount approved for our support team, because we're just here is the forecast of growth of tickets coming in, and they're the vast majority of tickets are actually account recovery.
Yeah, at that scale, every little thing just has crazy impact and effects and even GitHub itself suffered from, the account recovery with MFA process, right? I had friends emailing me when I first joined GitHub, let's say in the first, I don't know, between maybe 2017 to 2020, I'd have friends, and actually Kevin Cody Seth had reached out to me about this, and it's 6 months goes by. He's I cannot get basically you have to wait, I think, a period of 6 months back then before you could even kind of get some traction, meaning no activity on that account, so they can kind of say, well, nobody's really using it, so maybe you're that person. But that was a real problem. Basically they were yeah, if you didn't have your SSH, if you didn't have your recovery key, if you didn't have access to your SSH key, I think that was about it. I think that was about it. I really can't recall anymore. But anyways, just noting that GitHub itself pre-NPM's issues with that also suffered, and it took a long time. And I guess the last note I have on that is it felt like endless sessions and design docs to fix that for GitHub. So yeah, for NPM, I'm sure it was just very complex, and a lot of factors that, well, I know it was very complex, and there are a lot of factors that go into it. But overall, it's, I would say, do you have any rough statistics about, or in terms of how much that helped or hurt the enabling and requiring of MFA and having the recovery and all of that
I
stuff?
forget the exact numbers, but it was over 80% of accounts that had enforced 2FA from the top accounts the last time I had checked for all high impact packages. And for the top 100, it was in the mid 90s percentile. And the thing to keep in mind with these numbers, and I had this question I got asked by leadership, we were never aiming for 100%.
Sure.
There are accounts that are disabled. There's accounts that are abandoned. There are accounts that are banned in those
Right.
top accounts. So like we could never get to 100. Additionally, and this was part of our plan with the rollout, because we didn't invalidate existing working tokens, it was perfectly possible for someone in these top 100s, especially if they used like a bot account or something like that in automation, to not have to ever enforce the MFA, like to never actually implement the MFA on the account because they already had a minted token. And from like a threat model strategic perspective, we were not actively going against stopping token theft. Like token theft was not a huge risk, at least from like what we saw in actual malicious activity. It was leaked passwords. It was account takeovers through password stuffing. It was, like someone stealing something from spot A, being able to deploy that password to spot B. And that's what we were primarily focused on.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting from a threat model perspective that you guys went through that and actually looked at it, because I mean I know dealing with a lot of organizations, they're always scared about session token theft, right? And token theft in general, and whether or not that's really something that attackers go after is rather fascinating to me. So
to be clear, it definitely happens. And there were other things that we dealt with like infrastructure and stuff that had to do with token theft. And there's a big incident around that. So it's not that it doesn't happen. Like, especially when you have leaked tokens. So like, that's clearly like a problem. It was more like, to be explicit, how do we do best by our customers that we're asking a lot of? The adoption of MFA was quite low, and we were saying, hey, we're going to like force you to do this thing. So we were thinking about it in phases, and we were always approaching it with the thought that like, hey, in the future, we may make changes or do things to specifically go after token theft. But until we see token theft on the registry being a significant problem, we're going to scope this rollout. We're not going to try to boil the ocean. And I think that like, especially for like a lot of these kinds of campaigns where you're, a service, you're making changes to your customers and asking for them to improve their security posture, you really need to do it piecemeal and to try to like, what's the most bang for the buck that I can get here? And like, yeah, we don't want to just be like constantly rolling out new campaigns. So it's not something we were expecting to do overnight. But in the back of my mind, for example, we were thinking about what could the future of authentication and tokens look like for NPM all up. And in my mind, it was like, if we're really going to go after token theft, if we're really going to go after tokens, like we need to rethink long living tokens and authentication all up. So let's just not even bother with that in this pass. If we're going to do it, we'll do a whole thing specifically about tokens. Spoiler alert, didn't happen on my watch, but we did a bunch of improvements to improving tokens so that they could have better, maintenance on their own end for it.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, that, it goes back to that, like a well thought out process, a mature engineering organization that is thinking about, all right, what are the iterative approaches that I can take now to improve security versus, hey, I'm just going to boil the ocean and do it all at once, which is very rarely the way that we want to go about it.
Yeah. And from a risk perspective as well, like I mentioned that we had the malware scanning in place that was, like quite accurate. We were doing both static analysis and detonation. So like we were finding a lot of things. As I mentioned, there was a lot of malware on the registry, and really only where it mattered was when the malware is showing up in these high impact packages. And funny enough, we saw more incidents after we like ran out the basic account security roadmap. There wasn't another major ATO on my watch, but we did have people self-sabotage, and that became like a whole other angle that like, well, what do you do when like, someone's intentionally distributing malicious code on their packages?
Well, and that's,
I remember that. Yeah. Do you remember that, Seth?
Yeah. Where somebody like, somebody that has a popular package goes out and says, all right, well, I need to make money off this now. So I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, or I'm going to push out malware or a miner. I can see that happening, right? But it's usually not at the scale of the ATO, right? Like those large accounts. But I'm trying to
how is that
remember.
dealt with when people sort of, decide all of a sudden they don't want to, they don't want to, for whatever reason, they want to withhold a package or break people's builds, and I don't know if that's always the intention. I'm putting words in folks' mouth. I don't, but that can be the outcome, right? Broken
Yeah.
builds and whatnot.
Well, it's a challenge, and it becomes like a bit of a philosophical question. Like, when do we remove something? When does the registry get involved? And I talked a lot with the team about the role of being a steward and like where do we get involved? And you know, eh, NPM works because of trust. Users trust it. I mean, for the most part, a lot of people don't. And they like shitting on it, so that happens too. But
Sure.
like, trust really is the lifeblood of something like NPM, and that trust works both for people who are consuming and people who are publishing. And so, like, what is the difference to someone like intentionally breaking the interface of their package to a some major change, right? Like, for all intents and purposes, right? If I'm a maintainer of a major package and I want to, in a some major change, delete everything and just have a single line that says, like, fuck you, I'm out.
Yeah.
Like, if you did it in a major, like, who am I to say anything? Right? Like in with that in mind, I would say, hey, if someone wants to change the behavior of their software and they're using Semver to do that, that's fine. But where it becomes a problem is when it's malicious or when it starts to look like malware. And in general, the only time where we would act as NPM is when we would see something being intentionally malicious. And I think that that's really important because we're like, people write code that is unintentionally malicious or vulnerable. We're not going to delete that from the registry, right? You're going to publish CVEs, and we had NPM audit to surface those for you. So like, and on the same note, if you publish something accidentally that has a vulnerability, we're not going to go delete that from you for you.
Hmm.
And in fact, people would write us all the time asking for us to remove packages or versions, and we had a pretty hard stance about, the registry is intended to be immutable. I'm sorry that you didn't realize that your email address was being published when you published that. Read our terms and services. I'm sorry. Like, we're not going to delete things from the registry unless they are intentionally malicious.
There's constantly philosophical and technical considerations, it seems like, with every choice that you all have to make.
Yeah, because
Constantly.
removing something from the registry is as easy for someone who has the right permissions internal of running chat ops. It is, you literally go into a room in Slack and you run a specific command and you second factor, and if you have the permissions, you can delete any package, any version, anything. Now, there are guardrails in there, like, for a couple of different things, and there's a very few people who have that permission. And in theory, like, any of the engineers who work on NPM who have read-write access to S3 could potentially go in and change the buckets too. Again, there's all sorts of auditability and things in place to like stop a rogue agent from just doing wild things. But like, ultimately, our agents and the agents and engineers who are working on NPM need the permissions to do these things, to do their jobs. It needs to have an audit trail. It needs to be reversible, and those things are true. But the real challenge is like, what is the policy and when do you make the decision? And for some of these like protestware scenarios, we ended up landing on a place where it was like, hey, if what you're doing is non-destructive, if what you're doing is just like printing to the console, we're not going to take action, right? Like, there may or may not be a CVE that goes out for like, undocumented behavior was one that I saw actually land for quite a few pieces of these, but it was really only where something malicious was happening, or some behavior was clearly undocumented and slipped in. So for example, there was one instance, I won't be specific, where like there was a behavior change, and the behavior change went through both in like a Semper Major version and in a patch version. And so we removed the patch version, but we didn't remove the Semver Major version, but we did make a GitHub advisory for the Semver Major version. And so the general idea here was like, from our perspective, like, this shouldn't update from under you without you. Like a lot of people will automatically update Semver minors and Semver patches in CI and CD. So like there shouldn't update from under you without like some level of consent. But if you're consensually updating to the Semver major, fine. But like we're going to give you a heads up about what the change is through an advisory. And I think eventually in this case, when they documented that behavior, which I think was like printing to the command line or something like that, then we even removed the advisory when it was fully documented. And another example here too is like there was a helper package that was created, and the whole purpose of the helper package was to like print things into the command line on install or something like that. I forget the specifics, but we didn't do anything about the helper package at all, because the helper package was clearly documented about exactly what it did and its intent. And like if you dig into some of the language in NPM's policies, it's like certain kinds of tools are fine, but it's like the use of those tools that starts to become a problem.
I see. Okay. That's fairly interesting. Man, I have so many more questions, but I'm looking at the time and I'm like, I have time for a couple more. So those
Some more
couple questions,
questions.
yeah, it's just like I'm holding myself back here. This is a little, man.
I guess we'll have
All
to
right,
do a
we got
follow up.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sitting here. I'm like, how do I handle this? Because there's so much follow up there, but like, I do want to get to these two. Okay, maybe we can if we have time, maybe we can get back to that. So I'll ask these questions just to make sure they're actually covered. But
If they're ones
all
from the
right.
chat, I intentionally already covered those two that we
Yeah.
talked about.
I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
the discussion that we had about, or that you were going into about kind of the decisioning behind the scenes, right? Like that, and that initial, or that the second question that we had there about like what was going on within the registry for automated scanning, right? Like how is that actually being decisioned behind the scenes? I think that's what you were just talking about, Myles. And it, you know, like I feel like it's a rather like it's a hard, the knife edge that you have to walk between usability and security, right? Like we always talk about how that, you know, that push and pull as it goes back and forth, but the policies behind NPM are really driving a lot of that decisioning based on what you're saying.
Yeah, and there is human aspects. So like we do not, or at least when I was there, they did not automate any of the removal of packages. And
Okay.
so there are scanners that go in, and when scanners hit content, it creates like an issue essentially. And there is full-time staff that review every single one of those identified malwares and every single report that happens externally. If anything hits on a high impact package, that goes to the front of the queue and pings on call. But otherwise, they kind of go through in, you know, like best effort, because there's a lot and it's not considered really like critical to deal with it because people are not really downloading it. There's things in place to stop people from like typo squatting. There's things in place early on to automate and block the publishing of spam as well. So there are some safeguards like early in the publish process to catch some of it. But yeah, there is like a human being going in and reviewing it and documenting when we take action, what we took action on, why we took action, what the problem was.
Have
Yeah, and go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask, you know, from a transparency perspective, what the thinking was there, because I know, you know, especially in our Slack, like people that are looking into supply chain security from, you know, the outside, right? Like you talking about, hey, we're documenting a lot of this. I mean, it's in, you know, the policies that are there, but we also don't necessarily see the inner workings. And so I think that's where they start to jump on things like, well, it looks like NPM isn't banning these packages, right? Like we know there's automated scanning, but you know, the decisions behind the scenes are harder to understand.
Yeah, with what we have in place, there's like a chat op that's used for taking things down. I just put in a query. It's not exactly obvious because there's not a way to do it. But if you do type equals malware on the GitHub advisories DB, you can see every package that's been taken down as malware from NPM. There's 14,268 advisories with just looking at it, a whole page that were taken down as recently as yesterday. And so there's not like a ton of details. They don't publish the details of the malware itself. And there's like somewhat of a broad definition of what malware is. But like everything that's been taken down through automation, like shows up there.
Shows up there.
And so like that's kind of like the level of transparency, so that if you had installed that package, everything in the GitHub advisory database is wired up to NPM audit. So you would get warnings from NPM audit if you had installed any of these packages. Where it's gotten really weird, and I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a whole other thing that you'd want to talk about, but we're not talking about, is there were all of these squatting attacks. I'm trying to remember the fancy name that someone came up with for it, where basically someone was scanning GitHub and finding organizations and package names that were on GitHub that hadn't actually been published to NPM or had been published to third-party registries, and then going and registering those orgs on NPM and publishing packages, relying on the way in which third-party registry tools were working. And they were able to use this to like basically inject code into people's CI/CD systems. And so there was a non-trivial number of cases where we'd have some business be like, hey, all of a sudden, all of our packages are scanning as are throwing as malware when we NPM install. And the reason for that was like, hey, we'd actually banned that package on the public registry because someone did this this type of squatting attack on you. I'm trying to remember what the name of that attack was.
No worries. While you're thinking of that, I have another question for you. I just want to make sure we cover, which is like, have you been reached out to or consulted for like other people from other package management organizations, or even folks that are about to start, like, hey, I want to build my own package manager. I'm thinking like, for instance, AI obviously has a lot of avenues for package model sort of distribution, or I don't know, just has anyone ever reached out to you to say, hey, what are some lessons learned that we could incorporate as we're, building or maintaining our system?
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember there's a securing software repositories working group at the OpenSSF that I used to participate in. And that has stakeholders from a number of different registries across the port. So PyPI is there, RubyGems is there, NPM is there, folks from PHP, folks from Java, like you name the ecosystem, they've got different representatives there, crates.io also. And so the purpose of that working group was for kind of information sharing. Once NPM enforced MFA, for example, a number of different package registries started to follow suit. And so we shared privately some of like the actual, like even like the policy language directly with people, and some of like the point system thinking with some of the folks, so they could benefit from the work that we had done, and very much around like that kind of consulting type effort through that working group. I would say would be the closest that I've done. Internally, when I worked at GitHub, we consulted with like the NuGet group that also was within Microsoft, and some of the folks from VS Code as they were looking at building it. I mean, like generally, my take on it is that if you're thinking about building a package registry, don't.
Yeah,
I love it.
Like maybe don't. But I recognize that like it's a critical component, and like things like Hugging Face, for example, are like really making it so much easier for people to experiment with AI and models. I was like blown away the first time I played with it. But then the flip side is that I'm thinking about like, well, what's the supply chain security story here? And it terrifies me.
There wasn't one. Yeah.
And there's so many like phantom registries that you don't even realize that there are registries, a whole bunch that just like build on top of GitHub as a backing. Like I use Home Assistant at home, and like Hacks, for example, is like the user supplied extensions. And that's all built on top of GitHub, and GitHub releases as like a phantom registry. That's just terrifying to a certain extent, but also like I like convenience. So maybe I will just click install on this thing.
Yep.
Well, man,
yeah,
I know.
I know
you're about to. I know you're about to say,
yeah.
Seth. I'll just leave with this. I'll say this: like, it's amazing all the work you did, but it's also incredible that like I don't think people. I don't know if they realize like GitHub behind that really helps. Some of these folks don't have that level of support. So, but anyways, Seth, I'm sorry. I know you got
Yeah,
I have so much to
we want to be
cover. We really
cognizant.
maybe should do a part 2. So.
We should. We'll reach out, Myles, and do something in a as long as you're willing and have time for it. We appreciate you coming on and sharing your expertise, your backstory. I mean, there's a lot there that we could even dig in and on more, since it is fascinating to hear how people get where they're at. But I know you have a hard stop, so I want to be cognizant of that. Thank you so much for your time. Any final thoughts before we go ahead and close it out for today?
I just want to thank you for having me and thank those who are listening for their time. This is a lot of fun. It's nice to revisit some of these memories. And I guess I would just say for NPM in general, like I know that it's received, criticism and people have feelings about how much progress has been developed. I think back to Secession, if you've watched it. I talk about serious, like these people are serious or not serious. And like NPM is a serious registry. And doing things at those scale, that scale requires so much thought, attention, and work to just like the basic security of the registry when it's at that scale. And I don't think that people necessarily consider like just the KTLO of doing that. And I'm not like, trying to be an apologist for like, obviously things could be better invested in or things can be better, but like you sit down and you write down the list of names of people at GitHub who work even just tangentially, and it's massive when you start to think about between security and legal and compliance and support. And it's like I think a lot of people think about a product and they think, okay, like how many engineers work on this thing? But to really run a product at that scale requires such a massive cast of characters, and it's a lot of people I know at NPM who care a lot and put a lot of time in, even when it's not necessarily like clearly their day job or clearly what they're supposed to do. And I think it's because people care a lot. They care a lot about the people who are using it, their security, their reliability, and the JavaScript ecosystem is, I guess now it's number 2. Python just passed it. But it's JavaScript and TypeScript. So I don't know. We should run the numbers again. But it's one of clearly the most active and relied on ecosystems on the planet, and it's really important that it's secure.
Yep,
Very much
it is.
so.
It is. Yeah, well, we appreciate your time and effort, and we'll do we'll chat as far as a follow-up. We already have people in Slack that are saying they would like one for us to dig further.
Oh, thanks.
So of course, but again, we appreciate your time. We know you've got to go. So join us in Slack. If you have additional questions or whatever, we'll just queue them up for the next episode. So appreciate it, Myles. Ken, anything else before we
No, thank you, Myles. This is amazing. I know we kept you. You're late. My apologies, but thank you so much from me, from Seth, and from the community.
All right. Thanks all. We'll see you next week.
Thanks. See ya. Bye.